his remarkable practice and all his perspective. So before I hand it over to Rob, I would like to say a few sentences about today's ArchiTalk and his practice. Basically, over the past 40 years, the award-winning practice MGS Architects has built a reputation for being a design-led practice that is deeply connected to the strengths and needs of communities it serves. Their work spans many scales, from citywide policy and precinct planning to campuses, institutions, and individual buildings. What makes MGS distinctive is the way they collaborate, working with governments, basically communities, schools and universities, housing agencies, and the private sector to help transform places and strengthen the connections between people and their environments. So in today's presentation, Practice for Impact, Professor Rob McGuaran, founder and principal of MGS Architects, will share insights into how the practice is structured, the key issues that continue to drive their work, and some of the projects that best illustrate their impact over the past years. Thank you very much. Hand it over to you, Rob.
Thanks very much, Carissa, and welcome everybody. This will be a little bit of a ramble today. That's a fireside chat, if you like. Really musings on that 40 years in practice and how it has evolved and changed to tackle some of those wicked issues that Carissa's talked about. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia. We practice on Wurundjeri land in Melbourne. And recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture, and pay respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So as I talked about it in that little summary, we've really structured our work through this lens over a long period of time, and how that's changed has really evolved as we've learnt more, as the needs of our country, communities and cities that we work in has changed. But it's always been underpinned by this idea of bringing a particular lens that comes through what we learn as architects and urban designers as well. When I talk about impact, there's a lot of documents I see now that talk about impact. So I think it's worth saying, what do I mean by that? Where we are focused and why we are focused on what we have. How we've sought to, I suppose, with some humility, make an impact, not thinking that we can do more than is possible, but at the same time make it feel that we're making a difference. And I suppose the insights and skills we've needed to do that over time. It's always been through these lenses of being both collaborative and individual, analogue and digital, local and global art and design. They keep coming through, and I hope you see in the work, they keep coming through as themes in the work. The original practice started with soon myself, and soon after Ellie Giannini, who's also my sister-in-law. So it was pretty close, and then she was joined by Chris Jones, who was my brother-in-law. So very family-based originally as a practice. All of us were first in family to go to university. We didn't have the traditional connections, if you like, that Melbourne had in a lot of the big companies there. And so the pathway was often small public work or residential work for the private sector. That really wasn't an area that resonated with the practice and where we felt the city needed design thinking and our communities needed design thinking, and the initial shape of the practice emerged around developing these really deep strengths in master planning, urban design, facilitation, advocacy, etc. And I'll talk a little bit about that later, as well as the more conventional areas of architecture and interior design, and then in education too, for reasons I'll talk about a little later, really trying to develop deeper knowledge in that. And as it looks today, with I'm the last of the fossils that remain in the practice, but really being led by Catherine, Cameron, Josh and Elliot, who have reshaped it slightly, but it continues to remain focused on these areas. If I go to this question, this is something that in early discussions in the practice we talked about a lot. You know, if it matters and we genuinely care, then what are we prepared to do about it? I mean, we see, and I look at it quite cynically in some ways, we see now architects interested in affordable housing. I regret that for the first 30 years of my practice, particularly the larger practices were indifferent to affordable housing as an issue. It wasn't seen as something that was core to many of those practices, and their advocacy for what was needed, even based on the evidence, wasn't there. But for us, I suppose that because we got interested early in policy, interested early in data, interested early in working on research projects with universities, looking at issues of social equity and housing, looking at the quality of educational environments, etc. This sort of information became apparent to us as a trend that was dire, and that was something that we needed to actively be involved in. So if we were if we cared about it, we thought we needed to have the skills, the information and the collaborators in place to be impactful. And so what I'll talk to you about a little bit is how we've shaped this toolkit, which has really been to ensure that we were informed, but also that we'd earned a seat at the table. I mean, early in our practice, there were a lot of architects who felt, and in fact, the profession a lot of times assumed they had a seat at the table just because we're architects. You know, we understand these things. I think we learnt fairly early, particularly as a modestly sized practice and not a big institutional firm, that if we wanted to be taken seriously, then we needed to demonstrate that we had skin in the game. And that skin in the game meant that we had to bring valuable evidence of engagement with those sectors in which we wanted to work. You know, did we sit on boards or in advisory or support roles within not-for-profit organisations? Were we involved in the operations of universities or learning and teaching facilities? Were we engaged in community in work that was voluntary and not income producing? That was a genuine statement of commitment to learning so that we could then share that knowledge, but also be effective in advocating for those who didn't have a voice. And that particularly applies to those who are at risk of homelessness, people who are experiencing family violence and those sorts of issues. These are issues that we've been looking at for the last 30 years as a result of understanding, I suppose, more deeply that these were genuine and growing issues for Australia. So why did we want to practice in a different way? I think that came down to who we were. You know, I was the son of a farmer and a butcher. Sun and Ellie were first generation immigrants that came to Australia, Ellie as a 15-year-old, Sun to start university. So it was, we needed to practice in a different way if we wanted to be impactful and not just renovating houses and doing those more modest things. If we wanted to work in these areas that for us made sense, you know, and because for us, we'd been given an opportunity to for a great life in Australia, etc. And it was really thinking about, well, how do we pass that on, I suppose, and how do we use our skills in a way that's more meaningful than, you know, helping to determine which $50,000 fridge our client might like for their $3 million house. That for us wasn't going to cut the mustard. As we work through the areas of where we felt we had both a genuine interest and where we could be most useful in helping our communities and cities to be better, it was in these areas of master planning, advocacy, education, social housing and infrastructure that came as the really hot button items where there were gaps. You know, the profession wasn't very good at advocating, still has gaps in that space. Our decision making was rarely being well considered in a master plan sense. You know, it was very much siloed into individual areas. We're still seeing that with our housing or our transport and so on. Our infrastructure was falling behind the needs of community, and with federal government particularly pulling back from the committing to the provision of social and affordable housing and instead providing rental subsidies, we were seeing this emerging and growing gap in the provision of social and affordable housing. And, you know, I raised that in a book that I did as part of a RAIA scholarship in 2001 as a growing area of that was going to be a train wreck in 15 years' time if we didn't do something about it in 2001. And we're seeing that now. And, you know, those who express surprise that that is happening now just aren't looking at the data in a real way. A real strength, though, for particularly, I'm seeing it in Western Australia, and most of our capital cities, has been, though, our universities and our education system, and our universities in particular punching above their weight relative to the size of our population globally. But there was quite evident that they were under strain, but that their location in cities, their the aggregations of talent that came around those university and health areas in particular, etc., really provided some significant opportunities for Australia going forward. I mean, so just giving you a flavour of the work, our work in the housing space, starting in the 80s with the reuse of industrial buildings and etc. Real focus since really 1990 on social and affordable housing. A lot of it around case studies in using lazy land, you know, a car park that is unsafe. How do we make it safe? Maybe you have people live there was our response to that. But we lose cars. Well, let's have people live there that don't need cars, you know. those sorts of projects, we've done 3 of those. There's a number of others that have emerged in recent times that are built on that. But all of our work has been focused in housing on the not-for-profit sector in the last 25 years rather than on that broader commercial market. The work in the university and education space has been fairly comprehensive. We've had the opportunity to work with Monash for the last 17 years, more recently with UNSW, RMIT, Flinders University, University of Wollongong, Victoria University, La Trobe University, and so on. But really, each of those are quite different, and the work hasn't been just the sexy work of doing a nice, shiny new building. It's been working with them on their governance strategies, you know, to make the governance of master planning guide capital works, etc. And I'm at Curtin University today, and we can see the fabulous outcome of careful master planning for the this whole main street and bus interchange with housing and education that has been generated here, and the amazing transformation since I was over here doing a accreditation of the architecture school when it was in the old building, old leaking building, I should add, some years ago. But it just demonstrates with the vitality of students collaborating together and that bringing together of the university community in a place, how with good and integrated thinking we can get some fabulous results. But some of the most important work we did...
Sorry, just if I close this.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, thank you. Some of the most important work we've done in the space has been in the areas of advocacy through different lenses, and that's both involved publications. That was the take one in the series that we did as part of that scholarship on future Australian cities back in 2001 at one end. Some of the work we've done, you know, where every second year since 1990, I've done a self-funded study tour overseas to look at places of transformation, universities, etc., and met with those that are doing the work. And I found that for practitioners, a really great way to fast-track learning by learning from those who've done it. They're happy to share information when you're not a competitor in their backyard, as I found over that time. And I've learnt enormously through that space and been able to share it and hopefully pass it on in this context. What we... I want to give you some examples of how we've thought about why we're doing things as we're doing it as a practice. And I've deliberately used some older information here because it shows that our decision makers still really aren't learning about these issues to the level that they should be. And I'm sorry, I've used this case study based on Melbourne, but I think if I look at what's happening in WA, if I look at what's happening in South Australia, look at what's happening in Sydney, we're seeing similar attributes. So in Melbourne, a lot of our best and most fertile areas for for food production have been taken over by tract housing in the last 25 years. Melbourne's now more than 100 kilometres across. When we look at affordable lettings in 2015, and they were shocking in 2015, and we're in 2025 now, and I'm at the Ahuri conference over here in WA, and people are lamenting that in a place like New South Wales, for example, where 2 million people are renting, 90% are only in leasing arrangements of 12 months or less, and the cost of renting is going through the roof for those communities. In some places we've seen, and many of you on the call might have family or whatever in this space, because it is now a middle class problem. It's not just a problem for the most disadvantaged, as it was more likely at this time. But people are seeing its impact on the way we live, the way we invent. Are we prepared to be an entrepreneur when we come out of university with a HECS debt and are facing $1 million cliff to try and purchase a house? Less likely. I certainly wouldn't have started practice now in the circumstances I was in. So to be entrepreneurial now is to have rich parents. It's not to be without that backing. We're seeing this impact of not having a housing plan really impacting on where we go forward. One of the key things that we did at that time was we managed to convince 3 of the vice chancellors to come and attend with me an advocacy for, in the review of the plan for Melbourne, of the role of what we call national education and innovation clusters within the fabric of Melbourne. And that was what we were seeing through the great work that SGS under Marcus Spiller was doing, etc., was that Melbourne was facing this calamitous aggregation of the highest paid work, the greatest opportunities in the central city. And whereas when I started out in practice, most people could live within 10 kilometres of their job, we were seeing situations here where the average family in some communities was commuting 3 hours a day. So the bright light in that was that there were these aggregations almost at the same rate of high-paying jobs and innovation and new startup around these clusters of universities in the middle suburbs and in our regional cities. So we were seeing in Melbourne at Monash University with Monash Medical Centre a real aggregation of that in what was then called the Clayton Technology Precinct. We've seen the same in the north around La Trobe University and the health precincts in Heidelberg, and similarly with Deakin University at Geelong and in Burwood, and to a lesser extent in the west. But that gave us hope that if we look through the 20-minute city, we could have greater proximity to opportunities in an expanded Melbourne in a multinodal way through the lenses of these aggregations of innovation around universities, etc. And we're seeing that proposition of innovation precincts becoming more popular now, but it was already evident there when you looked at the data. So this gave you a bit of the indication of how we presented that information, but we were pointing out this real opportunity that we'd learned from our economic friends of the value of this corridor. And I'll give you an indication of the success of that. We were successful in getting that into Plan Melbourne. That's driven decisions about where governments, the reason that's important is that's driven decisions from government about where they invest in infrastructure, federally and in a state sense. So the Melbourne Metro could be called the University Line, for example, because it joins up Victoria University to the west of the city with Parkville and Melbourne University, with RMIT, with the Arts Precinct, and out to Caulfield with Monash. So for that, you know, we see a very significant percentage of Melbourne's GDP and talent all connected by this umbilical cord of transport through there. The same we were seeing at Clayton, but Clayton poorly connected to public transport. But from 2011, when we did the first master plan for Monash and got this into the planning system, to now, this precinct is now generating $7.7 billion more for the Victorian economy per annum than it was in 2011. So the benefit of thinking, of design thinking about how we shape the cities in doing that was something that we were really interested in, and where the evidence is there for that. And sorry about some of these smaller slides, but what I was trying to show here was this, how this change in the way work was happening. You know, governments were really slow to respond to this in a way that provided any equity for community. But let me take you through a bit of Monash's plans. So the unique idea that we developed for Monash was a series of individual silos of disciplines. It was dominated by parking and vehicle traffic. There was a record, well-published record, for how quickly you could get around the loop road of Monash, and the best average speed was 78 kilometres an hour at that time. That had been achieved proudly by advertised, and the classic campus of the university within as a donut, you know, surrounded by cars, but also internally. The university, though, was a university that was teaching double degrees, implicitly saying we want people to get more right and left brain and etc. happening, and we acknowledge that the world is becoming more complex and needs these different perspectives, but also that the research questions they were interested in addressing were typically either at the very least multidisciplinary, but often transdisciplinary. So how do you change a siloed university into something connected? And our propositions were get the cars out of there for a start and connect it up and put the nodes of engagement at the key intersections, adopting, if you like, a city approach to, and civic city approach to how we configure the city, and importantly, measuring the success of what we did, reporting on that success, and linking the capital program to the master plan, not to the faculties. So that was a big change. And when I first presented the master plan, the thing I said I was most proud of in the awards presentation was the governance structure we'd been able to get the university to adopt. And the architects in the room said, well, we don't get that. It's the role of an architect. It's been the key to Monash's success since then. So the master plan is now in its third iteration. This is the sort of transformation we did. So this is in an 18-month period, a sports walk, as it's now called. So there's a system of walks on campus. We've implemented 6.2 kilometres of the walks since 2011. This walk, for example, delivered 2 million more people to the campus centre after it was built than 18 months before that, what that road did, and how many people came to the campus centre. It joins sports and the campus centre. Those at Curtin would be familiar with the value of high quality streets, etc., from what's been delivered in recent times. But in talking about speed, I was at a government, a Huri conference talk this morning, and someone was lamenting that there wasn't enough evidence of student accommodation. Only 1%, for example, of the accommodation in New South Wales is student accommodation. But that also there wasn't, you know, it was important that government was at the centre of delivering housing and not others. In this instance, the university delivered 1,600 units, a park, new teaching spaces, retail, with 3 architects, great architects, McBride, Charles Ryan, Hayballs and JCB, and TCL, us as master planners, from the first we should bring more housing into the centre of the campus than has been typically there to link the housing on the edge to these other destinations, and to bring more life to the campus. From that first meeting to when the students moved in was 18 months. I can't think of any government projects that is delivering housing over 18 months from first thinking. So we need the private sector and institutions to be involved in fixing our housing problem, and many of those can deliver with value and at speed that government can't do. These are a few other images here that really show, so the campus centre on the right before, loading area, a couple of umbrellas, and after. Just, it wasn't always about the big statement. These were light touch, let's try things out, let's develop proof of concept before we make major investment. So $1 million investment in opening up the campus centre to the outside trees and umbrellas has now become a major competition focus for the university, that has been awarded recently for a new campus centre to take the university into the future. This was a project we did with JCB. This was the before. We opened up this intersection of major walks by removing some building but keeping it, and with JCB doing these quite theatrical ends, but these are areas of aggregation of students across disciplines in study areas, quite deliberately between, in this case, engineering and science, at the intersection of those two historical geographies on campus. So a lot of the initiatives were light touch, but the impact of that has been to see, and the environmental measures. So I was teaching a studio to final year students from Melbourne University last year, and I asked them, you know, what do you think in the survey results students said was most important about the campus? And, you know, some of them said, oh, the library, you know, etc. The answer was the birds. That it was this incredible bird life. For anybody that goes to Monash now, like the bird life and bird song is amazing. And it's been a credit to the work of the university and the commitment to this idea of a university experience, and their measurements about, you know, the transformation. So I'll give you a bit of data. 2011, 65% of students drove to campus, 35% walked or came by public transport. They still don't have a train, they only have buses. The nearest train station is 1.5 kilometres away. There's 65% of students walk to campus or catch public transport now. So the evidence has underpinned this. We have the evidence of, if you put a path in, how many people are walking on this path compared to previously? That is reported back. What is the environmental footprint of the campus? What is the utilisation of the learning and teaching facilities? How many disciplines or faculties are teaching into that space? All of that information embedded in the master plan objectives is reported to the university and its progress on those initiatives. How is our housing plan going for delivery on the campus and so on? It's a data and evidence-driven planning approach, and universities are uniquely placed to do that. But I think the lessons we've learned from that is so much of that can be applied to cities more broadly. This is a microcosm of the city, but this is the place that we're delivering. And equally important has been the minor things, you know, the investment of care in the way buildings are preserved, wayfinding, you know, changing, it's a lesson for Curtin, changing the streets and the numbers of buildings to conventional number 2's at that end, number 100's at that end, and they're along a street that you can find on Google Maps in an ordinary way. You don't need to understand the secret handshake that 501's next to 302, and you know, Monash had the situation that in a 200-metre long building historically, there were 2 tutorial rooms with the same number, 180 metres apart. So those things that seem unsexy but are really important in keeping people on campus, making them feel comfortable, making their parents feel comfortable when they come to visit, etc. It's in an age where we're seeing higher levels of anxiety, mental health issues, neurodiversity, etc. Making places legible, easy to get around, etc. has been a key part of what we do. And these are just some of the projects that have been delivered through that lens. In that learning and teaching, the funny thing that we found over a long period of time, we really were desperate to do a lot more work in education, particularly for government. Government's deemed until recently that we don't have the necessary skills or track record to be able to do a primary school or a secondary school extension or whatever. But interestingly, our opportunity in this space first came through a private school that wanted to be more like a university and wanted a master plan, strong master plan to inform their investment. So Cosca building, which wasn't just a building, we also took all the cars on campus and put them under the oval in the foreground, and new change rooms, etc., and introduced this idea of, you know, the Ignatians have, for those who know that, religion has an interesting proposition of reflection and also prospect in the way they think about growing a person capable to be a leader and make positive impacts. So this idea of journey through the campus became a really important element, and a facility that wasn't only, this facility arose out of the school's decision to close a campus and bring their year 7 and 8 students onto what was the senior campus. And so it was funded through that closure of the other campus in the most part. And we used it as an opportunity to join up the campus and to bring to this a lot of the work on salutogenic design that we'd learnt a lot about through our work for, in particular, social and public housing and people with high levels of anxiety and mental health concerns about, you know, it's really great science there about you connect to nature, you provide the small and the big spaces, you provide the materiality that keeps people grounded, and so on, and the clear wayfinding, etc. And you can make a real difference to the openness of people to learning, as well as their sense of feeling safe and welcome in a school, irrespective of their, I suppose, individual characteristics in on that diversity level. And you can see here the prospect, but in this case, the idea of and language developed by Catherine Ranger and the team was of this school sort of growing out of the historic roots of the school, which had all been around the dark hawthorn bricks, etc., but creating this bridge and journey from the school to the city. I could talk a lot more about that project, but this is some of the learning spaces, etc. within. Again, that project from commencement of the commission, winning the competition, to having to have the students in was 18 months. So it was pretty tight, and we used a lot of prefabrication in terms of mass timber, etc., to make that happen. Want to talk about homelessness. now, if we could.
10 minutes.
10 minutes, yep. So in the homelessness space, homelessness is now becoming a problem that's not just affecting those we would typically associate with homelessness. Why the domestic violence, you can see there is a big characteristic that's driving homelessness. The lack of supply of housing is doing that. The uncertainty of jobs is also impacting on that, the gig economy, etc. And rising mental health. Now, these are historic figures from about 5 years ago. The yellow is going up quite quickly. But what it tells you is that, and what I've seen in my research around the world, is it's the canary in the mine. If you don't solve the homelessness problem, if you don't have a commitment as a community to saying everybody deserves a safe place to sleep, then it's a slippery slope from there. I've been privileged to, I went over and met with the Y Foundation in Finland because, people say, well, you can't fix homelessness. Well, have a look at Finland. They fixed homelessness. It took them 40 years, but they had a plan. And as of the beginning of this year, the numbers are just how many homeless people occur this year. They're not a residual challenge that needs to be addressed. It's incredibly impressive, but they're a community of 3 million people. We should be able to do more in the cities that we have here and learn from what they've done. We've applied a lot of the thinking that we learned there in partnership with Vincent Care on the redevelopment of Osmond House. Osmond House had been there for over 50 years before we built this new building opposite Children's Hospital. Typically, people came into the service, they got support for 6 weeks. They were then sent out to go forth and good luck, and then they came back into the system. About 75% of them came back into the system. The new model that was put in place here was a comprehensive hub for services on the lower level. I would describe it as almost a subacute health housing at the intermediate levels, rooming house style accommodation where you have your own small motel unit with cooking and shower and a communal social space on the intermediate levels that could also share the common multi-purpose and dining and gym and library spaces on the ground floor, and then independent living in the upper floors. The results have been, instead of 75% of people coming back into the system after the delivery of the program, they have 25% of the people coming back into the system. So a really interesting model of how we can do things differently with much better value for the taxpayer in the long term, as well as much better outcomes for the individual. And here are some of the images inside, but real care about acoustics around wayfinding and salutogenic design. And this work has also informed our work at in social and affordable housing. This project in McIntyre Road won the national award, but it was really for communities that had strongly Mediterranean backgrounds in Melbourne's inner west, and the idea of creating the village came very early. We held back landscaping here and engaged with Stephanie Alexander's group and really allowed the residents to develop the landscapes. Some of it is food and some as flowers, basically, but really as a means to build community from a very early stage. And then the last part of this is around infrastructure. Why is it important? This is, again, the data. I find this one compelling. If I live in Carlton, this is the amount of jobs that I can get to by public transport in 45 minutes. If I live in Cranbourne East, this is the amount of jobs I can get to. So you can see immediately the vulnerability of households in those locations through that lens. You know, and this is in every city in Australia. We can point to this. This is our project in for new rail, Sky Rail as we called it, highly controversial in Melbourne in the other railway corridor, where they tried to, I suppose, take more the idea of having a series of vacuum cleaners along the, you know, it won awards the other project, but it was replicating the same station right along the system. We worked with the local community here to develop something that spoke to the place and connected the community here. It was uncontroversial locally and was acknowledged with the awards, etc. Similarly, working with First Nations people and communities in replicating the historic bridges across the Merritt Creek, same sorts of processes of telling local stories and engaging with youth and local people. And I'll flip through this because I don't think it's important and conclude there. Thank you, Parissa, and thank you those who stayed on.
Thanks so much, Rob. Fabulous presentation and insights. I think we can open that to all of the colleagues here and also online if you have any questions. Chris.
I've got a question. So number one question. As course coordinators, we have the day and we speak to parents who lovingly educate a child and they're looking to come to university. The question from the parents and from the 17-year-old is, can I make any money as an architect? Can I be an entrepreneur? Can I run my own thing? You've said during your presentation there that you effectively need to be born into a wealthy family in order to be an entrepreneur. Do you genuinely believe that, or do you still think there's an opportunity for architects to...
Look, I think that there are opportunities for architects in many different ways. I mean, technology and the ability to get one's voice out there more broadly, more quickly, if you've got the right capabilities, is clearly evidence. I wouldn't have described myself as the most gifted kid in the room. You know, my partner Sun was the most gifted kid in his year consistently and complementary to me. Ellie, remarkable mind in design that I would never have. But I was always, you know, I recognised my role was as a storyteller. And because I had always a genuine interest in matchmaking, really bringing together coalitions of the willing, so making work rather than taking work. It's hard to do that without deep knowledge. Now, that can come in different ways with different students. They can have a deep knowledge of the communities they're in. They can have, you know, a lot of the, you know, my daughter's friends, you know, they're absolutely passionate about some areas. So they've got knowledge I could never hope to have in some areas. And there are some that have, from their very early years, been deeply engaged with their communities. So they come to the table with something that me as a country kid coming to the city and then going to this university into this industry I knew nothing about, they'd be starting ahead of the game there. I think the challenge is around the barriers of, you know, they would have to make a decision early that they're going to invest in their business and not in their home, right? You know, and what will be, will be. I think that's easier as we get more options. You know, I'd love Australia to say, let's forget about the Australian dream of focus for the next 50 years. Let's say our target is at 50% rather than 65% or 70% of people will own their own home, but everyone will live in dignity. Yep, and that housing is essential infrastructure. If we have that and your students can focus on, I am absolutely passionate about X, I'm absolutely passionate about the way new technology can apply to the way we make buildings, whatever it is, and go for that, knowing that they can be near the aggregations of talent that they need, etc. You know, I'm hopeful in those spaces, but I'm also realistic to say, gee, there's a hell of a lot more barriers now than there was when I was starting out, you know, and that is the reality. So they've got to be either a lot more talented, they've got to identify the gap, or they've just got to have already been really passionate about something, etc. I think that's not to say they can't go into firms and become leaders of firms, like the people that have gone into the next generation of our practice. They really, you know, those possibilities absolutely exist. And, you know, the 4 directors that are now leading my practice, they're amazing. You know, they're really talented people, and I can see the next generation coming up through also the same. So you don't have to always start something yourself to get ahead as well. And I'd probably say that's an easier pathway now, but that's a pathway of compromise. I mean, you know, in that you're not absolutely shaping it around your vision. You're working about how you can find space for your parts of your vision within a bigger ecosystem. But I'd argue that's the way cities and places need to work anyway. You know, you're always, to be most effective, you've got to bring a bit of humility to the table and say, how do I adapt and fill a gap? Yeah, you know,
and provide enough safety nets for young people to take risks.
That's right. You know, and that's what I'm wanting to see more of. You know, I was at the conference this morning and somebody was saying, oh, we need to take delivery of housing away from the private sector and give it to government. And A, that'll never fix our housing problem. And B, it's not government that's the problem. It's not the private sector it's the problem. It's the atomising of rental housing in that's the problem, of mum and dad investors with 1 or 2 properties, rather than saying, you know, we've got organisations with 10,000 properties. You know, they'll take a very different view, evidenced by the rest of the world, than that, for example. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. Anyone else here? Okay, online, if anyone else has any questions. If not, I do have one. I'm just trying to take some notes. So how can we accelerate the transformation, Rob? You talked about advocacy. From your perspective as a principal of an established practice in Melbourne, what are the practical ways for us as architects, urban planners, you know, master planners, to push this positive transformation, to kind of bring that positive impact?
Well, we were talking about it earlier in a way, Parissa, and that is, I mean, what architects have now that I didn't have when I started out was access to large amounts of data. Mm-hmm. And we can get much more of that freely. And it's making sense of that data and asking the right questions about that data and interrogating it that opens the possibilities. But the ability to assemble strong evidence quickly and more immediately address challenges that are emerging is something that I think our architectural and urban design training is getting better at equipping us to do. And So I think that's how we can also accelerate things, by pointing to the challenges, pointing to both the challenges and opportunities. I've found over the years, politicians and decision makers always like a good story rather than a bad story. I've learned I get very little traction by saying, these kids are going to be homeless. I mean, I find that devastating, but that's the reality, because that's a bad story and they don't know how to fix it. Just don't tell me about it. But if you say, look, we've done this project for these kids and they've had extraordinary pathways since, they've been, for example, Melbourne City Mission in Melbourne's got this fabulous program of where they provide not only housing but education and training pathways for these kids between 12 and 17 who have fallen into homelessness and are in really vulnerable situations. And to hear people come through that have graduated in social work and are now working in a sector, after landing homeless after fleeing a violent household in Brisbane to Melbourne as a 12-year-old girl. A, the guts that person had, but B, what an extraordinary result, and by wrapping your arms around these kids and providing them with the tools to succeed, and presenting that to the politicians. Oh, so it works, well, we should have a look at that. Was something, they're not taking a risk, the evidence is there, and it's a great result, and they can imagine themselves standing next to some kid talking about, and that's fantastic. So tick, tick, tick. So it's really, thinking about how do you become the voice for those that, I talked about it earlier, voice for those that don't have a voice. And all the people on this screen, I've talked to about how it's changed their lives. And we do a lot of post-occupancy discussions, etc. as well. But that gives you such energy, but also gives you the stories to tell people in the future. The people in the bottom right, they are some of the residents of a housing project where I'd had to stand up at a public meeting with 450 residents of the local area who'd had something circulated to say the people who will come into this will be paedophiles, graffiti artists, thieves, rapists, etc. They're going to change your suburb for the worst, in an unnamed newsletter that went around. All these angry people coming into the room, and when we finished the project, it won awards, etc. But for me, the best thing was that one of the most spiteful people and the person who took their case furthest with us to court came up to me at the swimming pool one day afterwards, and I thought, oh, here we go, and said, I wanted to tell you I was wrong. And one of the residents in this building looked after his cat for him on the weekends because, he'd go down to the coast, and he realised only afterwards, these were people, when this 30-unit development opened, there was 900 years of local residency in the residents that went in. They were locals. They knew the area and they knew how to fit into the area, etc. Surprised me. I knew that from the evidence that I collected, so I was able to be an advocate in those areas to the point that we only had one objector at the end of, that took it all the way at a 450, and even they were happy afterwards, so, but it's by having that evidence, but that gives you the energy to keep going, and it's one of the most exciting things as an architect, being a voice for people But to be a voice, you have to have the evidence and the facts. You can't be shooting your mouth off. And unfortunately, at the moment, we've got too many well-meaning people in that space who are making assertions about older housing, public housing stock, etc., not always with all the information.
Thank you so much, Rob. I have two quick comments here because it's 2:02, so we need to wrap it up. Lee Simonton, our colleague, said, sorry, I'm just scrolling up. Thanks, great presentation and so many great points. Just a little note to say I agree about the wayfinding and numbering of buildings at Curtin. Thanks, Lee. And Darcy, again, our colleague at Curtin, fantastic to see your work on campus design. Wondering about how you negotiate this relationship between knowledge and place at the campus in the deeper sense of country.
Yep.
Country capital C. We have an amazing framework at Curtin called the Curtin Living Knowledge Stream that considers this and embeds the movement of water through the campus as the ground of a millennia of knowing. How does MGS work? Embed with country as the foundation of the integrated and master planning design processes?
Yeah, look, it's a really good question, and it's been a learning journey for us in that space. And it's not the same everywhere, as would be obvious. I mean, we start obviously by having the right people engaged within the universities. Most of the universities now have great leaders, DVCs and organisations representing, I suppose, the broader voice and having the engagement protocols, etc., with First Nations communities, students coming into the campus, etc. That's our starting point. And on our side also having the right consultants, because whilst we know a little bit, we don't know enough. And you've got to recognise that you need the right minds in that space. So it's no one size fits all for what's the right approach to each campus. Even for the one university, RMIT is a recent example. We've got 3 very different contexts: an urban campus, a very ancient campus, with very significant cultural artefacts, etc., and a former industrial site. So each requires a different response, but through the same leadership. It's important that ultimately it's a guiding voice within the master planning, that it is properly resourced within the master planning and governance structures to be actualised, not just sit on the shelf. I'd say it's not only in our campuses that we do that. I can't think of a project we haven't done in the last 3 or 4 years that hasn't been central.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. It was great to have you here in person, Rob.
Pleasure to be here.
And thank you all of my colleagues who joined us today.
Thank you.
I hope I can stop the recording.